Do you ever ask yourself, why is breastfeeding so hard? If we are mammals, why doesn't it just come easily? If we are designed or evolved to feed our babies milk from our own bodies, why do we struggle so much? I have asked myself this question so many times over the last 10 years. And I've done a lot of thinking and reading and research and learning about the topic. And I would like to offer some of my own thoughts that, of course, are not my own thoughts because they come from other really smart people. And I would like anyone who is interested in purchasing my all-time favorite book about this topic from my bookshop. It's called The Big Letdown. It's by Kimberly Seals Allers. And she explains why breastfeeding in the modern world is so difficult in such a concise way that will really make your blood boil. I'll have that linked in the show notes. So let's get into it.
When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. Having known only a handful of people who had ever done it and only seeing it up close a couple of times, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a childbirth educator, and an internationally board-certified lactation consultant, or an IBCLC. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore the systemic, medical, and cultural barriers that make feeding our babies so difficult, so that you know your baby feeding struggles are not your fault. And your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are.
I want to start with a quote. That quote comes from the National Institute of Health's National Library of Medicine article called Breastfeeding from an Evolutionary Perspective. And that author said this: the future of any animal community inescapably depends on the survival of its offspring. And limiting the claim to our species, our conviction that without the mother who has breastfed her infants, mankind would not exist. And it's true. My main three focuses for today are going to be talking about feeding our babies from an anthropological perspective, from a cultural perspective, a modern cultural perspective, and from an evolutionary perspective. And so let's get into the evolutionary perspective first. The authors of that article that I just mentioned talked about how when we think about the evolution of a species, when it comes to infant feeding, we have to think about what is good for the species, not just when it comes to the infant, but when it comes to the parents as well, because any adaptation has to benefit both. And I thought this was an interesting point because so many times when it comes to feeding choices, we are often talking to the parents about what is best for the baby. What is best for the baby? Breast milk is best for the baby. Breast milk is best for the baby. But the author points out that actually breast milk, evolutionarily speaking, benefited both the offspring and the mother. It benefited both parts of the dyad. Otherwise, that would not have been what we evolved to do. So it benefited the young, and we know this because it provided the child a relatively high probability of survival, but it also provided the mother a minimal nutritional loss. We also know that feeding the child breast milk was good for the parent because it allowed the parent to feed the baby milk for a certain amount of time, which warded off the onset of the menstrual cycle. And then after a short period of time, the baby could wean, and then that menstrual cycle could start again. But we know that this relationship of breastfeeding was flexible. It was adaptable to the environment that the dyad lived in. If mom and baby are in an environment where there are not a lot of other nutritional resources, then mom and baby can extend that breastfeeding relationship for much longer, and baby can rely on that breast milk as the primary nutritional resource for much longer, because it does continue to provide the nutrients that the baby needs and adapts to the needs of the age of the baby. And it's very adaptable. And that was one of the reasons why humans evolved in this way, because wherever humans lived, the breast milk really served the purpose. So if they were in an environment where there were fewer food sources, breast milk still allowed the infants to survive until they were able to find more food sources. Okay, so from an anthropological perspective, they talked about how there is a period of tension between the mother and the offspring. And there's this conflict of interest between the mother and the baby. And this tends to underlie common breastfeeding problems. And it's not something that we really talk about, but it is the source of what we perceive as low milk supply or problematic infant crying. This tension is natural between the mom and baby dyad. And it comes up in the evolutionary research and it comes up in the anthropological research. But because we don't see this tension between the mom and baby dyad as natural, when that tension arises, the mom seems to think that something is wrong with her or something is wrong with her baby. But if we are able to see this as normal and we adopt a more flexible and individualized approach, this is what the researchers said in the second article now. This article is also from the National Institute of Health, from the Library of Medicine. It's called Optimizing Breastfeeding: What Can We Learn from Evolutionary, Comparative, and Anthropological Aspects of Lactation? So this was saying that if we recognize this tension between the dyad as just a normal part of the relationship, it may allow for a more creative approach to solving these problems. Incorporating evolutionary concepts may enhance research investigating the mother infant signaling during breastfeeding. What these researchers had to say about the role of evolution and culture in breastfeeding was something that I have been talking about for a long time, which I am so glad to see playing out in this research, is that primate lactation is characterized less by instinct and to a much greater extent by learning. So, the advantage that this has is that there's a lot more flexibility to adapt to your environment and to your circumstances. But the author mentions that this leads to more vulnerability. For instance, it can be seen in some studies of primates like gorillas who were not raised or are not raised in environments around other gorillas, and then they have their first babies. They don't know how to care for those infants. So we think that this is instinctual for other mammals, and it's not. If they do not grow up in environments where they see other animals or other primates caring for their babies and breastfeeding, it becomes more difficult. There was a video that went viral not too long ago of a gorilla who had already had one baby, and that baby needed to be taken from her because she was not caring for the baby. And so she now had a second baby in the zoo, and they were trying to teach her how to care for the baby. So this time they set up a TV in her enclosure, and it played on a loop videos of gorillas caring for their babies so that she could see that and she would watch it intently. And then once she had her baby, there was a zookeeper who was also breastfeeding her own child. And that zookeeper volunteered to come with her baby, sit in front of the enclosure, and walk her through breastfeeding her gorilla baby, which she had not done yet in the first few days postpartum. Once the zookeeper showed the gorilla what to do, then the gorilla caught on and was able to feed her baby from her body. That just goes to show that if we live in societies where we do not grow up being surrounded by breastfeeding, being surrounded by seeing people feed babies from their bodies, it then becomes much harder for us to do so. And this plays out in the anthropological research and in the research of other primates as well. Another interesting adaptation of human milk is that relative to other primates, human milk is rich in HMOs, or human milk oligosaccharides, and these are very protective against infections. And it is believed that our milk has evolved to have these HMOs to protect us because we live in more sedentary communities. And so we need this extra form of protection. And so then the second point then goes along with this first point, is that compared with lactation in other primates, human lactation exhibits an even greater reliance on learning. There is a considerable societal and cultural importance illustrated in the anthropological data around rituals. And there's a large number of rituals around childbirth and lactation that is seen in the anthropological data around the world. So, when there is a lack of knowledge of lactation embedded in the cultural and traditional practices, that helps explain why it's hard to promote breastfeeding with pregnant women, because in industrialized societies, we have lost many of these rituals. And so it makes it more difficult to improve the breastfeeding rates when we have lost the cultural primacy, is how it gets put in the article, of this practice. So, one of the ways that the researchers suggest that we counteract this is, instead of teaching pregnant women about breastfeeding, we should be teaching children and young people, adolescents, about breastfeeding, because they are the ones that need to be exposed to the knowledge, to the practices, to seeing people feeding, so that it becomes more ingrained culturally and societally. It also goes on to say that these breastfeeding practices used to get passed on between women. The wisdom was passed down woman to woman, but now partners have become the primary support person. And so this teaching should not just be done to one gender, but it should be that all genders are learning about breastfeeding from a very young age. And then finally, the researcher talks about signaling and how signaling happens. There is both behavioral and psychological mechanisms that happen in the infant feeding model. There is also physiological signaling that happens inside the milk itself. And this is an area where there is very little research, but we might be losing some signaling between the feeding dyad because we have lost breastfeeding. And so we know that milk contains numerous possible signaling components: nutrients, growth factors, hormones, bacteria, cells, microRNA, and they're generally very poorly understood. And often, when these signals that get passed between the parent and the baby during human milk feeding, because during body to baby feeding, the signaling, it doesn't just happen from the parent to the baby during feeding, but there is this signaling that passes between mom and baby physiologically. But it's not very well studied, because when scientists are studying human milk, they're usually isolating one component or isolating one or two components, and it's not being looked at fully as one entire entity. And so we're not seeing the full signaling that's happening between mom and baby. So there are methodological issues related to this that makes it impossible for us to know what is being lost in that mom baby dyad and in that signaling that is happening. So there are some recommendations that these authors, whose names are Futrell, Shukri, and Wells, there are some recommendations that they make. And I like the way that they put this out there, because they make recommendations for researchers, for policymakers, and for healthcare professionals. And for researchers, they suggest that researchers investigate mother infant dynamic interactions in breastfeeding, including these signaling pathways relating to both physiological and behavior signaling. They suggest investigating methods for reducing tension in mother infant dyads to be able to improve the breastfeeding outcomes, and investigating how to change maternal breastfeeding behavior and to help make the people feeding babies more receptive to advice that acknowledge research outcomes. And then for policymakers, it's really important to recognize that, because we can see in the anthropological and evolutionary research that breastfeeding is really adaptive, that we not create uniform policies, because different people in different areas are going to need different approaches. So we want to have a greater emphasis on individualized approaches based on individualized needs. We want a greater emphasis on normalizing and educating children and young people, and a focus on persuading women that evolved behaviors such as earlier introduction of complementary foods and cessation of breastfeeding may have been favored, in part because they maximize maternal reproductive fitness. So, meaning we we started introducing solids earlier, and we started weaning earlier, because that meant that we could start having babies earlier. But now that we don't want to have as many babies, it is actually more beneficial to the infant to feed for longer. So having policies that suggest earlier weaning is really outdated. And then for health professionals, expect variability in breastfeeding experience, and also teach dyads to expect that. And then when mothers are reporting problems such as infant crying, dissatisfied infants, perceived insufficient milk, and these aren't entirely due to illness or latching concerns, explain that there is a degree of tension that is an expected part of breastfeeding, and that is a normal part of the breastfeeding relationship, which is so interesting, because essentially the infant is wanting more and the mother has her own needs to protect, and so that tension kind of arises between the two, because in the end both individuals are looking out for their own needs first and foremost on a subconscious level. It is so important for us to understand why these things are so challenging. We can't move forward until we understand why things are difficult. However, if you are experiencing difficulty, knowing the why, anthropologically and evolutionary speaking, might be interesting, but what you really need is somebody by your side who can help you figure out what is going on, help you problem solve, help you make each right next step as it comes, And I would love to be that person for you. So reach out to me at www.quavinbirthservices.com. Can't wait to talk to you and help you feel better about your baby feeding experiences.